It was November 23, 1944. The war was entering its final winter. Germany was retreating on all fronts, but the Wehrmacht was far from defeated. They still controlled vast territories. They still had millions of soldiers. They still had the ability to inflict devastating casualties on Allied forces. In eastern France, near the German border, a critical supply convoy was preparing to depart. The convoy consisted of 47 vehicles, trucks carrying ammunition, fuel tankers, staff cars with officers, and armored vehicles for protection. The cargo was desperately needed by German forces defending the Siegfried Line. The convoy would travel along a route that had been used dozens of times before, a narrow forest road that wound through the Vosges Mountains. The road was considered relatively safe. Allied forces rarely operated in this area. German patrols controlled the territory. The greatest danger was mechanical breakdown, not enemy action. The convoy commander was Major Klaus Steiner, a veteran logistics officer with 3 years of experience moving supplies through hostile territory. Steiner had survived partisan ambushes in Yugoslavia, Soviet attacks in Ukraine, and Allied air raids in France. He was cautious, competent, and deeply experienced. Steiner briefed his drivers at 1800 hours. The convoy would depart at 2000 hours after dark. They would travel without headlights to avoid detection from the air. They would maintain radio silence except in emergencies. They would reach their destination by dawn. It was a routine operation, one of hundreds that occurred every day across the collapsing Third Reich. Except this convoy would never reach its destination. By dawn, all 47 vehicles would have vanished. Over 200 German soldiers would be gone, and there would be no sign of combat. No bullet casings, no blood, no bodies. Just an empty forest road and a mystery that would haunt German military intelligence for the remainder of the war. The trap that wasn't there, what Major Steiner didn't know was that French resistance forces had been tracking German convoy movements in the region for weeks. They had identified patterns. They had mapped routes. They had studied German security procedures, and they had developed a plan so audacious, so psychologically sophisticated, that it would allow them to capture an entire German convoy without firing a single shot. The architect of the plan was a resistance leader known only as Renard, the Fox. His real name was Marcel Dubois, a former mathematics professor who had fled Paris when the Germans invaded. Dubois had no military training, but he had a brilliant tactical mind and a deep understanding of human psychology. Dubois understood something fundamental about convoy operations. Drivers follow the vehicle ahead of them. If you control the lead vehicle, you control the entire convoy. But controlling the lead vehicle conventionally, through ambush and capture, would alert the rest of the convoy. They would scatter, call for reinforcements, and escape. Dubois' plan was different. He would make the convoy want to follow the lead vehicle. He would make them believe they were safe. He would lead them, like sheep, exactly where he wanted them to go, and then he would make them disappear. The preparation for 3 weeks, the resistance had prepared the trap. They had selected a location deep in the Vosges forest where multiple logging roads intersected. The area was remote, surrounded by dense forest with minimal German presence. They had constructed fake road signs that looked identical to official German Wehrmacht signage. They had created dummy checkpoints that appeared to be legitimate German security posts. They had prepared vehicles that looked like German military transport. Most importantly, they had dug massive concealment pits along the route. These pits, covered with camouflage netting and forest debris, were large enough to hide entire vehicles. From the road, they were invisible. But from inside the pits, resistance fighters could observe everything passing above them. The plan was complex, requiring precise timing and coordination. Any mistake would result in the convoy escaping, or worse, the resistance fighters being discovered and killed, but Dubois believed it would work. Because the plan exploited a fundamental weakness in German military psychology, the assumption that following orders and following the lead vehicle were the same thing. The departure at 2000 hours on November 23rd. Major Steiner's convoy departed from the supply depot. The vehicles moved slowly through the darkness, maintaining formation, their engines rumbling through the cold night air. The lead vehicle was an armored car carrying a navigator with maps and route instructions. Behind it were the fuel tankers, the most valuable and vulnerable components of the convoy. Then came the ammunition trucks. Then the staff cars. Finally, more armored vehicles providing rear security. Steiner rode in the middle of the convoy, where he could communicate with both the front and rear elements. He watched the dark forest pass by, alert for any signs of ambush or danger. Everything seemed normal. The road was empty. The forest was quiet. The convoy maintained its pace and formation exactly as planned. At 2145 hours, the convoy reached a fork in the road. According to their maps, they should turn left. But at the intersection was a German checkpoint, or what appeared to be a German checkpoint. A soldier in Wehrmacht uniform stood in the road, holding a lantern. Behind him was a military vehicle with proper markings. A sign indicated that the left road was closed due to bridge damage. The convoy should take the right fork instead. The navigator in the lead vehicle didn't question this. Roadwork and repairs were common. The checkpoint looked legitimate. The soldier was wearing the correct uniform. The signage matched official Wehrmacht standards. The convoy turned right, the redirection. What the Germans didn't know was that the checkpoint was entirely fake. The soldier was a resistance fighter wearing a captured uniform. The vehicle was a captured German truck. The sign had been manufactured by resistance craftsmen who had studied German military documentation procedures. Once the convoy turned onto the right fork, it was committed. The road led deeper into the forest, away from German-controlled territory, toward the area the resistance had prepared. At 22:30 hours, the convoy encountered another checkpoint. Again, a Wehrmacht soldier directing traffic. Again, instructions to divert to another route due to security concerns. Again, proper signage and procedure. The convoy followed the instructions. By now, they were several kilometers off their planned route. But this didn't alarm anyone. Diversions were common. The checkpoints appeared legitimate. There was no reason to suspect deception. Major Steiner, in the middle of the convoy, had no visibility of what was happening at the front. He could only follow the vehicles ahead of him. He assumed the lead vehicle was following proper routes based on checkpoint instructions. At 23:15 hours, the convoy was led onto a narrow logging road. The road was barely wide enough for the vehicles. Dense forest pressed in from both sides. The convoy slowed to maintain safe spacing. This was exactly what the resistance wanted. A slow-moving convoy stretched out along a narrow road, unable to maneuver or turn around quickly. The separation at 23:30 hours, the lead vehicle was directed by another fake checkpoint to stop. The checkpoint officer explained there was a temporary delay ahead. The convoy should wait for clearance to proceed. The lead vehicle stopped. The vehicles behind it stopped. The convoy came to a complete halt on the narrow forest road, but this halt was staggered. Because of the road's curves and the spacing between vehicles, different parts of the convoy couldn't see each other. The front vehicles didn't know what the rear vehicles were doing. The rear vehicles couldn't see the front. This is when the resistance executed the most brilliant part of the plan. They didn't attack. They didn't engage. They simply began redirecting vehicles one by one onto different side roads. A resistance fighter, dressed as a German military police officer, would approach a vehicle and inform the driver that they needed to reposition for security reasons. The driver should follow the vehicle ahead, which was being directed to a temporary holding area. Because the drivers couldn't see the rest of the convoy, because they were used to following orders, because the officers looked and sounded legitimate, they complied. One by one, vehicles were peeled off the main convoy and directed onto side roads that led to concealment areas where more resistance fighters were waiting. The process took 3 hours. By 02:30 hours on November 24th, the entire convoy had been separated into individual vehicles or small groups, all positioned in different locations, none of them aware that the convoy had been divided. The capture with the convoy now completely dispersed and isolated. The resistance began the capture phase. Small groups of resistance fighters, heavily armed, would approach each vehicle. They would identify themselves. They would order the German soldiers to surrender. And they would explain that resistance was futile because the entire convoy was surrounded and captured. Most German soldiers, shocked and confused, surrendered without resistance. They had no idea where they were. They couldn't contact other vehicles because radio silence had been maintained. They were outnumbered by armed partisans. Fighting seemed pointless. A few soldiers attempted resistance. Small firefights occurred in several locations, but these were quickly suppressed. The resistance had overwhelming local superiority at each vehicle location. By dawn on November 24th, the capture was complete. Over 200 German soldiers had been taken prisoner. 47 vehicles had been captured intact. The ammunition and fuel had been seized, and not a single resistance fighter had been killed. Most remarkably, the vast majority of the capture had occurred without gunfire. The German soldiers had been psychologically defeated before any physical combat occurred. They had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and outmaneuvered through deception rather than force. The disappearance. The captured vehicles were immediately hidden. The resistance had prepared concealment locations throughout the forest. Vehicles were driven into prepared pits, covered with camouflage, and hidden from aerial observation. The German prisoners were marched to temporary holding facilities deep in the forest. They were separated into small groups to prevent organization. They were told that they would be transferred to Allied custody, but that for now, they needed to remain hidden. The road where the convoy had been captured was swept clean of evidence. Tire tracks were erased. Any signs of the convoy's passage were eliminated. The fake checkpoints were dismantled. The fake signs were removed. By noon on November 24th, there was no physical evidence that a German convoy had ever passed through the area. When Major Steiner's convoy failed to arrive at its destination by dawn on November 24th, German command initially assumed mechanical problems or wrong turns. Convoys occasionally got lost in the complex road networks of eastern France, but as hours passed without any radio contact, concern grew. By afternoon, the convoy was officially listed as missing. German military intelligence launched an investigation. Search parties were dispatched along the convoy's planned route. Aircraft conducted aerial reconnaissance. Radio operators tried to establish contact with the convoy's communications equipment. They found nothing. No wreckage. No signs of combat, no indication of what had happened. The road where the convoy should have traveled was empty. There were no tire tracks, no evidence of vehicle passage, no abandoned equipment. It was as if the convoy had simply vanished into thin air. German intelligence considered several possibilities. Theory 1. Aerial attack. Perhaps Allied aircraft had destroyed the convoy. But there was no wreckage, no bomb craters, no evidence of fire or explosion. Theory 2, partisan ambush. Perhaps the resistance had attacked, but there was no sign of combat. No bullet casings, no blood. Partisan ambushes were violent and left evidence. Theory 3, desertion. Perhaps the entire convoy had deserted. But this seemed unlikely. Over 200 soldiers simultaneously deciding to abandon their posts would require coordination and planning that seemed implausible. Theory 4. Navigation error. Perhaps. The convoy had taken a wrong turn and become lost, but the convoy had an experienced navigator with maps. How could they get so completely lost that they couldn't be found? German intelligence officers were baffled. They had dealt with partisan activity throughout occupied Europe. They understood how resistance forces operated, but they had never encountered anything like this. A complete convoy disappearing without any trace. Some officers began to suspect supernatural explanations, that the convoy had been cursed, that the forest itself had swallowed them. These theories were officially dismissed but privately entertained by soldiers who had seen the unexplainable horrors of the Eastern Front. The interrogation. 3 days after the convoy vanished, German forces captured a French civilian near the area where the convoy had last been seen. The civilian was subjected to harsh interrogation by the Gestapo. Under torture, the civilian revealed that the resistance had been active in the area, that they had been planning some kind of operation, that something had happened to a German convoy, but the civilian didn't know the details. He had heard rumors, whispers, but nothing concrete. The Gestapo investigated further. They arrested more civilians. They conducted raids on suspected resistance locations. They tried to find anyone who knew what had happened, but the resistance had maintained operational security. Only those directly involved in the operation knew the full plan, and those individuals had either gone into hiding or had been evacuated to areas beyond German reach. By early December, German intelligence had to accept an uncomfortable truth. They had no idea what had happened to Major Steiner's convoy. It had simply vanished, and they would probably never know the full story. The resistance success for the French resistance, the convoy capture was a massive success. They had seized ammunition, fuel, vehicles, and weapons that would support their operations for months. But more importantly, they had demonstrated a new form of warfare. They had proved that psychological manipulation could be as effective as firepower. That deception could achieve what direct combat couldn't. Marcel Dubois, Renard, was hailed as a tactical genius within the resistance. His plan had worked better than anyone expected. Zero resistance casualties, complete capture of enemy forces, total psychological dominance. Other resistance cells began studying Dubois' methods. They tried to replicate the deception tactics. Over the next few months, several similar operations were attempted in other regions. Most of these attempts failed. The Germans became more suspicious of checkpoints. They verified orders more carefully. They maintained better communication with forward elements. But the fact that the tactics were attempted at all showed how influential the successful convoy capture had been. Dubois had proved that with sufficient planning and psychological insight, small forces could defeat much larger enemies without conventional combat. The prisoner's fate, the 200-plus German soldiers captured from Major Steiner's convoy, were held by the resistance for several weeks. They were kept in hidden forest camps, guarded by armed partisans, and given minimal rations. The prisoners were confused and demoralized. They didn't understand what had happened. They had been following orders, following the lead vehicle, and suddenly they were prisoners. Major Steiner, once he understood the full scope of the deception, was reportedly both impressed and humiliated. He had been completely outmaneuvered without ever realizing he was under attack. In January 1945, as Allied forces advanced into the region, the prisoners were transferred to American custody. They were interrogated about their capture. American intelligence officers were fascinated by the story. They interviewed prisoners extensively, trying to understand exactly how the resistance had executed such a sophisticated deception. The prisoners' accounts were remarkably consistent. They described being redirected by what appeared to be legitimate German checkpoints. They described following orders that seemed reasonable. They described never realizing they were being led into a trap until it was too late. One prisoner, Corporal Hans Weber, described the psychological experience. "We thought we were safe. We were following our own people's orders. The checkpoints looked correct. The uniforms looked correct. Everything seemed legitimate. We had no reason to suspect deception. When we realized we had been captured, I felt a strange emotion. Not anger, not fear, but embarrassment. We had been outsmarted so completely that it seemed almost comical. We were professional soldiers, and we had been led around like children. The strategic impact, the convoy disappearance, had effects beyond the immediate tactical victory. German forces in the region became paranoid about checkpoint authenticity. They began requiring more verification procedures, which slowed their logistics and reduced efficiency. German commanders became reluctant to send large convoys through areas where resistance activity was suspected. This forced them to use smaller, more frequent supply runs, which were actually more vulnerable to traditional ambush tactics. The psychological impact on German soldiers was significant. If an entire convoy could vanish without a trace, what else was possible? What other deceptions were the resistance planning? This uncertainty created a climate of fear that reduced German operational effectiveness throughout eastern France in the final months of the war. After the war ended, Marcel Dubois emerged from hiding and began writing about his resistance activities. In 1947, he published a memoir titled Le Convoy fantôme, The Phantom Convoy, describing the operation in detail. The book caused a sensation. For the first time, the full scope of the deception was revealed. Dubois explained the planning, the execution, the psychological principles underlying the operation. Military strategists around the world studied the convoy capture. It became a case study in unconventional warfare, psychological operations, and the use of deception in military operations. American military intelligence invited Dubois to speak at various training facilities. He gave lectures on how small forces could defeat larger enemies through superior planning and psychological insight. Soviet military intelligence also took interest in the operation. They studied it for lessons about partisan warfare and deception tactics. The operation influenced Cold War-era thinking about unconventional warfare. Both NATO and Warsaw Pact forces incorporated similar deception techniques into their training. The German response former. German officers who had been involved in the search for the convoy were interviewed after the war. Their reactions varied. Some expressed grudging admiration for the resistance operation. They acknowledged that it had been brilliantly executed and that German forces had been comprehensively outwitted. Others were bitter. They felt that the resistance had violated norms of warfare by using deception rather than direct combat. They argued that soldiers should fight like soldiers, not like con artists, but most acknowledged that in war, victory is what matters. The resistance had won. German forces had lost. The method was less important than the outcome. Major Klaus Steiner, the convoy commander, gave a notable interview in 1952. He had spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner and had time to reflect on what had happened. "I was outmaneuvered by someone smarter than me," Steiner said. "There's no shame in that. Dubois understood something I didn't, that soldiers are trained to follow orders and trust their chain of command. He exploited that training against us. If I had been more suspicious, if I had questioned the checkpoints, if I had verified the orders, perhaps we would have avoided capture, but hindsight is meaningless. In the moment, everything seemed legitimate. The operation taught me that in war, assumptions are dangerous. We assumed the checkpoints were genuine. We assumed we were safe. We assumed wrong, and it cost us everything. The psychological analysis military psychologists have studied the convoy capture extensively as an example of how human psychology can be exploited in warfare. The operation succeeded because it exploited several cognitive biases. Authority bias. Soldiers are trained to obey authority figures. The fake checkpoints exploited this by presenting themselves as legitimate authority. Confirmation bias. The convoy expected to encounter German checkpoints. When they saw checkpoints that looked German, they didn't question them because the checkpoints confirmed their expectations. Social proof. Each vehicle followed the vehicle ahead of it. If the lead vehicle was following checkpoint instructions, the vehicles behind assumed those instructions were correct. Compartmentalization. Because different parts of the convoy couldn't see each other, no one had a complete picture of what was happening. Each driver only knew their immediate situation. These biases are universal. They affect all military forces. Understanding them is crucial for both conducting effective deception and avoiding being deceived. Modern military training includes extensive education on cognitive biases specifically because of lessons learned from operations, like the convoy capture. The modern relevance. The convoy capture remains relevant to contemporary military thinking. In an age of GPS navigation and satellite communications, the specific tactics used by Dubois might not work, but the principles remain valid. Modern military deception still exploits the tendency to trust apparent authority. Cyber warfare involves creating fake authentication credentials. Information warfare involves creating fake news sources that appear legitimate. The convoy capture demonstrated that the most effective deceptions are those that don't require the victim to do anything unusual. The German soldiers followed standard procedures. They obeyed apparent orders. They acted exactly as they were trained to act. And that's precisely why the deception worked. The ethical questions. The convoy capture raises interesting ethical questions about warfare and deception. Was the resistance operation legitimate? From a legal perspective, yes. Combatants are permitted to use deception. Disguising yourself as the enemy to conduct operations is generally considered acceptable under the laws of war, as long as you don't misuse protected symbols like the Red Cross. But was it ethical? Some argue that deception, while legal, is morally questionable, that soldiers should fight with honor and transparency rather than through trickery. Others argue that in war, where lives are at stake, any tactic that reduces casualties is morally superior to direct combat. The convoy was captured with minimal violence. Most German soldiers survived unharmed. This was better than an ambush that would have killed many. There is no consensus on these questions. Different ethical frameworks produce different conclusions. Today, the forest road where the convoy vanished still exists. It's a quiet, narrow road through the Vosges Mountains, used primarily by forestry vehicles and occasional tourists. There's a small memorial at one of the intersections where the convoy was redirected. The plaque, erected in 1985, reads, "Here in November 1944, French resistance forces, through courage and ingenuity, captured an entire German convoy without bloodshed. This victory demonstrated that intelligence and planning can triumph over superior force. Very few people visit the memorial. The story of the Phantom Convoy remains relatively obscure, known primarily to military historians and World War II enthusiasts. But the road remembers. Local people still tell stories about the night when hundreds of German soldiers simply disappeared. The stories have been embellished over the years. Some versions claim the convoy was swallowed by the forest. Others claim supernatural intervention. The truth, as Marcel Dubois documented, was more remarkable than any legend. A mathematics professor with no military training had designed an operation that outthought professional German officers. A small resistance cell had captured a force many times their size without firing shots. The operation proved something important, that warfare is as much about psychology as about firepower. That the best weapon is sometimes a clever plan. That deception, properly executed, can achieve what force cannot. On the night of November 23, 1944, an entire German convoy vanished without a single shot fired. Not because of supernatural forces, not because of superior Allied technology, but because a brilliant tactician understood human psychology better than the enemy understood their own vulnerability. Major Klaus Steiner and his 200 soldiers followed orders. They trusted their senses. They made reasonable decisions based on available information, and they walked straight into a trap so sophisticated, so psychologically perfect, that they never realized they were being captured until the moment they became prisoners. That is the legacy of the Phantom Convoy. Not just a tactical victory, but a lesson about the power of the human mind, about how intelligence can overcome force, about how the greatest battles are sometimes won without weapons. The German convoy vanished into the forest, and when it emerged, it was no longer a convoy. It was a cautionary tale about the limits of conventional thinking and the power of unconventional warfare. The forest swallowed them whole. Not through magic, but through a plan so perfect that it seemed impossible, until it happened.